السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. وكالة أدت دورا ناشطا في زعزعة الاستقرار على مستوى العالم أجمع وبأحدث التقنيات العلمية، ليس أقلها الحملات الإعلامية المضللة والتخريب الاقتصادي وتنظيم جماعات تمرد وعصيان وتجنيد العملاء وإثارة الحروب وتنفيذ عمليات الاغتيال. كتاب وكالة الاستخبارات المركزية السي نادي القتلة لمايكل اوبرسكالسكي من الداخل. معكم زينب صفار، تابعونا. هي الأخطبوط الذي امتدت أذرعه في داخل المجتمعات كافة، ولا سيما في أمريكا الوسطى والجنوبية وغرب أفريقيا والمنطقة العربية، نظرا لمواقعها الاستراتيجية وثرواتها النفطية والمائية ومواردها الطبيعية وشعبها المقاوم. هي وكالة الاستخبارات المركزية، وتعرف اختصارا بالسي أحد أهم الأجهزة الرئيسية للتجسس ومقاومة التجسس في الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية، والتي أنشئت إبان الحرب العالمية الثانية عام 1947 بأمر من الرئيس الأمريكي هاري ترومان، الذي قدم لموظفي وقادة دوائر الاستخبارات المركزية القبعات السوداء والدروع والخناجر، ومنحهم لقب وشعار فرسان الدرع والخنجر، بمعنى آخر قراصنة البحر. الوكالة أوكلت 3 أنشطة رئيسية: جمع المعلومات عن الحكومات الأجنبية والشركات والأفراد، تحليل تلك المعلومات جنبا إلى جنب مع معلومات جمعتها وكالات استخبارات أمريكية أخرى، وذلك لتقييم المعلومات المتعلقة بالأمن القومي وتقديمها لكبار صانعي السياسة الأمريكية. وبناء على طلب من رئيس الولايات المتحدة، تنفذ الوكالة أو تشرف على النشاطات السرية وبعض العمليات التكتيكية من قبل موظفيها أو الجيش الأمريكي أو شركاء آخرين. وينسب إلى وكالة المخابرات المركزية سلسلة طويلة من العمليات السياسية والعسكرية في العديد من دول العالم، حيث جرى العديد من الانقلابات العسكرية والتصفيات الفردية والجماعية. كما تلعب الوكالة دورا كبيرا في التنظيمات النقابية والثقافية عن طريق التدخل في نشاطاتها، إضافة إلى تمويلها للعديد من دور النشر لنشر الكتب المؤيدة لسياسات الولايات المتحدة، وكذلك باستخدام شخصيات ذات اطلاع وكفاءة عالية لتسويق أفكارها ومعتقداتها خدمة للسياسة الأمريكية. في عام 2013 ذكرت صحيفة واشنطن بوست أن السي لها أكبر ميزانية من بين مجتمع الاستخبارات الأمريكي. مؤلف كتاب السي نادي القتلة، الصحفي الألماني مايكل اوبرسكالسكي، كيف يصف تركيبة المجتمع الاستخباراتي الأمريكي اليوم، وكيف ظهرت وكالة الاستخبارات المركزية، وكيف أحكمت قبضتها على مفاصل السلطة التنفيذية داخل الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية، وما العلاقة التي تربط الوكالة بأجهزة استخبارات عالمية. Michael Operskalsky, German writer and investigative journalist and editor and publisher of غهايم and Top Secret magazine that deals with CIA and US covert activities. Welcome to من الداخل, or from the inside, sir.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. You're most welcome, sir. Well, actually, let's talk a bit, Michael, firstly about the structures of the US intelligence community today.
Which is very important. Although the basic structures did not change very much. But of course they were adopted during the especially last 10, 15 years. Adopted on which levels? Number one, 20 years ago, the CIA and other United States intelligence services were relying 90-95% or even more on high-tech operations, using NSA, using whatever, they have plenty of possibilities and a lot of money. And the so-called human intelligence was downplayed. So at the end of the day, they realized slowly that they got a hell of information, but they need people to analyze the stuff. And then they need to execute things according to the analysis. So they run out of so-called human resources. Yeah. And they started to realize it very, 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 very heavily about 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. They discussed it even quite publicly, so in the media. Mm-hmm. And they started to call for people, ex-CIA officers who are private now in so-called security companies, etc., who were retired, mm-hmm. to come back to the agency to continue their work on so-called human intelligence. So this is number one. They have increased that, especially during the last years. This is a change to the situation about 20, 15 years ago. Second, they have developed, due to more human intelligence now in the special operations departments, mm-hmm. because they are different, mm-hmm. which includes the killer activities, mm-hmm. which was a little bit downgraded before because they were really thinking with the money, with the NSA and with eyes dropping, etc., they can mm-hmm. do everything. Third thing is that they have, this was a lesson from the war against Iraq. As you know, there are a lot of so-called private companies working either for the CIA or for the army, and all the staff there are ex-army officers or ex-special forces or ex-CIA. Mm-hmm. Now and it was somehow simultaneously organized, but now the CIA has much more control on these companies. And their aim is to...
Can you name some of these companies, please?
They change every 3, 4 years. Mm-hmm. A very famous one is, as you know, is Executive Outcomes. Then they had a company that came out of a magazine that was even published in the States called Soldier of Fortune. And out of that came a company and they form a company, it takes a day, and they go to a country, the company is finished. You can see it in a very famous movie mm-hmm. That was recently released about the CIA operation to release the so-called hostages, some of the hostages in Tehran. Where they Argo, right? Mm. Where they formed the company just for one purpose, and after it was disappeared.
Michael, how did the CIA get all this power to the extent of controlling all the main joints of the American executive bodies, both internally and abroad?
I think just now we were talking about recent developments, but this basic question you are asking me is related to a long history. Mm-hmm. The key.
Since you talked about this in your book back in 1988, and up till now, up till today, this momentum just increased and increased.
Yeah, it has to be so because the American policy in general, because of the economic crisis, the United States is no more the economic giant as it was 20, 30 years ago, number one. Number two is the cultural hegemony is over. When I was a young boy, American music, American whatever was always the big thing. Mm-hmm. Now, even in Germany, ordinary people, if something is from the United States, they even don't like. So the hegemony on many levels, many aspects, is not finished, but it's not the same as it was decades ago. And they answered to this challenge by increasing the military and the intelligence operators. And this is a logical thing.
Now, you talked also back in 1988 about the New World Order. How do the US strategies translate into this today?
Okay, I think to understand this strategy behind the New World Order, somehow it's very simple, because you just need to read at least one book of Mr. Zbigniew Brzezinski, who's one of the key planner, the key strategist, And this was published in 1993 or 1994, if I'm not very wrong. And it is about this, I think the remaining superpower, something like the title. And he really described in detail what is the main task for the American ruling class for today. And at that time, 1993, 1994, and for the future. And exactly what he wrote happened still till then. Number one, he said the war against Yugoslavia is necessary because of geopolitical strategies. He said the Russia has to be finished, and exactly they're working on it. And then he was, even that there are maps inside, it's fascinating, the book. I can recommend reading it because you really understand what's going on today.
Now, allow me to go back now to the issue of the CIA and how its different arms operate. And they talk about the soft power, which is through making use of certain kind of NGOs, cultural centers, think tanks, as a part of the intelligence gathering and, the recruitment issue. What can you tell us about that, please?
This is another thing. What has changed, especially during the last 10, 15 years. The question of HUMINT, and part of HUMINT is the so-called NGO civil society chaps. And they're very active, very active. I give you concrete, detailed examples. Especially the old game, the old dirty game against Iran is highly concentrated nowadays on building up a civil society in Iran. No,
not only in Iran,
not
but
only
also
in Iran,
this happened in Hong Kong, for example.
In Hong Kong, in Russia, the same thing in Russia.
True.
And these are some of the main. They were very, very successful in South Africa, by the way. So forget about the ANC, the liberation, everything. They have really
the African National Congress. True.
They have really finished the thing to a very, very painful situation as it is now. They are concentrating now on Russia, Eastern Europe, those countries around Russia. So a lot of things that happened in Ukraine can be explained by those kind of operations before, years before it happened. Mrs. Nuland, responsible state secretary for
Victoria
the region,
Nolan
said we invested $5 billion in the regime change in Kiev, and using these kind of things. Optor, the famous body that was created in Yugoslavia to topple Milosevic, and the war, prepared the war against Yugoslavia, the same thing. Optor is like a think tank now that sent people everywhere, training people for civil society. Iran is the next very important, is a hell of money that is going to the so-called civil society in Iran now. You can see it when you go to any German airport, especially those who have direct link to Iran. You find 2 or 3 people for civil society going to Iran. Very well equipped and etc.
Right. Michael, allow us to stop now for a short break, and then afterwards we'll talk a bit more about the links that exist between the CIA, the Mossad, and the BND, which is the German Federal Intelligence Service. إذن فاصل قصير ونعود، لا تذهبوا بعيدا. مؤلف كتاب CIA نادي القتلة، الصحفي الألماني مايكل اوبرسكالسكي، كيف يصف مختلف أذرع وكالة الاستخبارات المركزية والتي تعمل تحت مسميات متنوعة كالمنظمات غير الحكومية ومراكز ثقافية ومراكز أبحاث، التي ما فتئت تؤدي دورا أساسيا في جمع المعلومات الاستخبارية، بالإضافة إلى الوسائل الإعلامية المتعددة والمنغمسة في حملات تضليل من خلال فبركة الحقائق المزورة والترويج لها ونشرها.
This is an important, even more important now with the new, so-called new media. Take Facebook, take
the social media.
Oh, the social media. It's a key thing. Sometimes they create a special social media, even media communication for influencing things on the ground. And easy to create fabricated stories and to spread them in a few seconds around the whole globe. And at the end of the day, it's all rubbish. This is one thing. Second is media is also done by journalists. And what it's interesting, and this is a
they
new...
create something which is like called
alternative media. This is exactly what I want to say. In the past, they were just mainly concentrating on, as I would like to qualify them, conservative, United States loving, etc., journalists, and they could plant everything into their pocket. Now they concentrate a lot on so-called alternative media, so-called green, you know, the green movement in Europe, even left-wing people that I personally know, they go and they are recruited by the CIA before, and they work for the CIA, and because they go to hotspots, and the people think, finally there's a journalist, he's positive, because he sounds positive, he looks positive, he smells positive, but he's
embedded with the CIA.
Yes, exactly.
Now, what links exist, Michael, between the CIA, the Mossad, and the BND, which is better known as the Foreign Intelligence Agency of Germany, and how well are they all integrated in their activities with Zionist pressure groups in American decision-making centers?
This is a key question, because number one, the days are over that the BND, the German Foreign Service, is just a puppet partner. Since 1989, 1990, 1991, so-called unification, they have their own agenda, which is in many cases the same agenda as the Americans, but they have their own interests. Number one, it's important to understand. Before they were just receiving orders and they executed. Now the Americans know very well where are the strongholds and the strong positions of Mossad, of BND and others, and they use them through cooperation. I give you one example. Especially in the Middle East, the BND and Germany has, I do not understand why, but as a matter of fact, there's the myth that the Germans are better. So for them, sometimes if a German passport, you can easily operate. And I can tell you that the BND gives regularly up to, there's a strong indication, 10 blanco passports to the Mossad agent. So, and therefore they have operational tasks together. The assassination of brother Imad Mugniyah could only work with the help, through the help of Mr. Conrad, the first secretary of the German embassy in Damascus, who had all the sensitive information, who recruited people, and then the hit team was Mossad and CIA. And so
now you are also blaming the BND for
Mr. Conrad,
killing.
Who was later on involved.
Do you have solid information for this?
Yeah,
do you have
very solid.
that document what you say?
I was never prosecuted. Even I was interviewed in some radio stations. Normally they prosecute you easily, but why didn't they do? Because it's correct.
Documents, this coordination that you talked about, let's listen to this, that documents leaked by Edward Snowden, the American whistleblower, suggested that Britain and the US had been spying on their ally, Germany, and Germans were enraged to discover that the US National Security Agency, the NSA, had listened into Angela Merkel's telephone calls. And according to a report in the German news magazine Focus, British intelligence officials have threatened to stop sharing information if Germany presses ahead with a parliamentary inquiry into British and American spying. We know that the German intelligence depends, as you talked, it does not only depend, maybe it gives the British and the Americans, they also depend on on the German intelligence, but particularly when monitoring jihadists returning from Syria and Iraq. What's going to happen now, Michael?
First of all, the thing is that what Mr. Snowden
divulged,
exposed, it's very dirty, no doubt, but it's a daily thing. The German, they operate in the States also against the Americans, which do the British against the Germans. It's a competition among the lions, the dirty lions. So that's not very shocking, I think. What is shocking is, and an answer to the question you raised, that the so-called jihadists, they can only exist and operate in Germany, in France, in Britain, and in Belgium, which are the four most important countries, because basically they are, to a certain extent, supported and shielded by the intelligence services. Why? Number one,
that's why they need the information, perhaps, from the UK and the Americans.
Exactly. Why? Number one, their prime target is to topple the Syrian government, by all means. The means before have failed, so they supported more and more radical groups. And you cannot differentiate between al-Nusra and Daesh, it's all the same. So they send money and weapons, everything, even BND to al-Nusra and the so-called Islamic Front especially. It goes from German airport and ports directly via Turkey. So that you cannot stop them and not stopping the other. So it's a problem. What is the problem for the Germans and the other Western intelligence services? Unless they don't change their policy towards Syria, the problem of so-called jihad in Europe will continue. So they try to fix it on the surface, just here and there, to put some people behind the bars. Nothing comes out of it, but new people are coming, and then they have the problem with the relationship with Turkey, because Turkey is supporting the war against Syria, and Turkey is very influential, especially in Germany and German politics. So there's no real strategy from the ruling circles in Western Europe to get rid of those terrorist activities, because they think, and still they think, they can to some extent control them as long as they achieve their long-term perspective, that's to say the regime change in Damascus.
Now, Michael, irrespective of a nuclear agreement reached between Iran and the P5+1, the region already is rebalancing, and observers say that regional rebalancing will also be affected by the bilateral rebalancing that is taking place between Europe and America, epitomized in the open rift between Germany and the US. There is a rift also in the different statements coming from Germany and the US regarding Syria, for example, and regarding Ukraine and whatever, which began with the eavesdropping scandal and has widened with suspicions that NATO is undermining Franco-German peace efforts in Ukraine.
I think there's more on the surface than there's a real base for this. Why? Number one, if you go to the real facts, for example, Ukraine, we could go in detail, but I would like to generalize it. The coup in Kiev, this is the cause of all the problems that came later, was jointly organized by the Americans and the European, especially the Germans. This was a joint operation. There's a slight different approach. While the Germans have a more tendency towards the building up of the fifth column of Russia, inside Russia, the Americans, they still use the stick. They are not against the fifth column, but more energy is towards the stick, so direct military pressure, atomic rockets, this kind of thing. So this is it's not a rift. There's the same aim.
But a different approach.
That's it.
Different approach. Right, Mr. Michael Oberskalaski, German writer and investigative journalist and publisher of غهايم and Top Secret magazine that deals with the CIA and US covert activities. Many thanks indeed for joining us.
شكرا.
You're most welcome, sir.
مع السلامة.
إذا لقاء جديد في الأسبوع المقبل مع ضيف جديد وقضية جديدة ودائما من الداخل. للمزيد من التواصل بريدنا theinside@almayadeen.net وصفحتنا على الفيسبوك من الداخل. من كل فريق عمل من الداخل من كل الميادين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.